Today we will delve into the atmosphere not only of human tragedies, but also of heroism, something not inherent in everyone. On the eve of Christmas 1990, the Tieta sisters, 20-year-old Lanai and 16-year-old Trisha, were incredibly excited when they learned that they would spend the upcoming holidays with their family in their cozy cabin in the mountains of Utah, in Reber Canyon. The time and the quiet landscape offered them the opportunity to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life and be alone with their thoughts. The house was so far from civilization that in winter it was only accessible by snowmobile when the ground was covered with a thick layer of snow. The Tieta family loved their mountain cabin, where they could escape reality, and every year a large, friendly group of people happily gathered there. 49-year-old Kate Tide and her 76-year-old mother, Beth Pott, volunteered to decorate the cabin for Christmas. Create a festive atmosphere, they hung stockings over the fireplace. 2 days before Christmas Eve, on December 22, 1990, the entire family went to Salt Lake City for business. What they could not have known was that at the same time, 2 men were breaking into their cozy mountain home. The 25-year-old Lester Taylor and the 21-year-old Edward Stephen Day had been released on parole from prison about a week earlier, on December 14, 1990, as part of a special program for the socialization of prisoners. Day had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for arson in 1989, while Taylor was serving a 15-year sentence for aggravated burglary. Both were supposed to find a job before Christmas and return to the correctional facility. However, instead of fulfilling their obligations, the men went on the run and found the perfect place to hide while they were being hunted. While staying in the Teed family cabin, Taylor called a fellow inmate at the Salt Lake City Community Correctional Center and told him that he and Day planned to rob some vacant cabin. He also excitedly announced that he wanted to wait for the residents to return to the cabin they were staying in so they could steal their car. As Lanai, her mother Kate, and her grandmother Beth made their way home, they were unaware of the danger awaiting them. They trudged through a snowstorm, freezing to the bone, eager to reach the warm, cozy house. Lanai urged her mother to hurry and open the door as her hands were ice cold. Kate picked up the shopping bags and walked to the door, while Lanai peeked through the kitchen window and noticed movement behind the refrigerator. She wasn't particularly alarmed as the family was expecting guests, and Lanai assumed it was her cousin who had decided to surprise them by hiding, ready to suddenly appear with a hug. However, when Lanai entered and began unpacking, an unknown man with curly hair and a gray hoodie emerged from behind the refrigerator and pointed a gun at the young woman. Around the same time, Kate was confronted by a second assailant, came out of the bedroom with a pistol in hand. Kate looked at the strangers in shock and asked what they wanted. She continued speaking, telling the men they could take whatever they needed. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence in the room, and then gunshots rang out. Taylor shot Kate and Beth without any warning or remorse before they even realized what was happening. Lanai watched in horror as her mother fell to the floor, and moments later, she saw her grandmother being shot in the head. Everything around her was soaked in blood, and it seemed to Lanai that what was happening had nothing to do with reality. She heard her grandmother gasping for air and saw a large pool of blood spreading under her mother's body. Only when everything around her became silent did time seem to slow down and normalize, and she realized that her mother and grandmother were dead. Despite the trauma she had experienced, Lanai quickly began considering all possible outcomes in her head, trying to figure out how to protect the other family members from the nightmare in the cabin. Eventually, Lanai decided to lure the criminals out of the cabin before her father and sister returned. Rolf and Trisha were following the mountain path with a slight delay, giving Lanai hope that she still had enough time. Unfortunately, as she went to the garage to show the criminals where her father had hidden the car keys, she heard the sound of an approaching snowmobile. At that moment, a man in a gray hoodie grabbed Lanai from behind, put his arm around her neck, and pressed a gun to her back. Rolf and Tricia had just driven into the driveway when one of the assailants, wearing a ski mask, sprang towards them and ordered the newly arrived family members into the house. When Rolf saw the tears in his eldest daughter's eyes, he immediately realized that something terrible had happened to his wife and mother-in-law. Quietly entered the house, and the criminals asked him if he had any money. The man pulled everything he had out of his pockets and threw it on the floor. In that second, Taylor ordered Day to shoot Rolf. For some reason, the gun didn't fire. The weapon had misfired. At that moment, Taylor, who was holding Linai, drew his weapon and aimed it at Rolf. First time he pulled the trigger, there was no shot, and the same thing happened the second time. However, the third shot was successful and so powerful that Linai, who was being held by Taylor, felt the recoil. The bullet hit Rolf right in the face, and he immediately fell to the ground. Linai thought her father was dead, just like her mother and grandmother. Unable to look at the lifeless bodies of her relatives, she tried to distract herself by looking around the cabin. She noticed that the festive food had been eaten, and the gifts had been opened. Obviously, the criminals had been in the house for some time, waiting specifically for the return of the cabin owner. Since there were always several reserve cans of gasoline for the snowmobiles in the cabin, Taylor and Day decided to set the house on fire before leaving. They poured gasoline on the upper floors, threw in a match, and ran outside. Moments later, the fire alarm sounded, and the intruders fled the scene. Linai and Tricia were forced to drive the snowmobiles, while Taylor and Day sat behind them. At that moment, both sisters thought they would be killed as soon as they helped the criminals reach their destination. They went through many escape scenarios in their minds, but none guaranteed their survival. Luckily, a neighbor of the Teed family heard the gunshots and saw the snowmobiles speeding off into the distance. He immediately called the police to report the incident. As Linai and Tricia made their way to the gate leading to the main road, they spotted their uncle, Randy Zorn, who was visiting for the holidays. When he saw his nieces on the snowmobiles, he assumed they were out with friends and began waving at them. Knowing that their uncle was in grave danger, the sisters ignored his greeting and sped past. Randy was surprised that his nieces didn't acknowledge him, and so went down to the parking lot, where the Teed family usually parked their cars. One of the assailants asked Tricia about Randy. The girl lied and said he was just a friendly neighbor who lived nearby in the mountain. When they reached the parking lot where the car was parked, the men forcibly placed the sisters in the back seat. Tricia noticed that one of the men had placed his gun in the trunk and thought they had a chance to escape. However, the assailant immediately approached them as if reading their thoughts, unzipped his coat, and revealed a knife hidden in an inside pocket. Randy reached the parking lot just as the family's vehicle was pulling away and saw a frightened Linai in the back seat of the car. He waved his arms again, trying to stop the car, but the girls ignored their uncle once more, attempting to save his life. As he stood there, still not understanding what was happening, Randy noticed a snowmobile approaching him. The driver of the snowmobile was not properly dressed, wasn't wearing a helmet, coat, gloves. As the snowmobile drew closer, Randy recognized his brother Rolf. His face was severely swollen, and bloody icicles hung from his chin. He told his brother that he had miraculously survived the headshot and the house fire, pretending to be dead and trying not to make a sound while the criminals were in the cabin. After Linai and Tricia left the cabin with the criminals, Rolf sprang from the ground and snuck into the bathroom. He tore off his burning winter suit and climbed into the shower to extinguish the flames. He could think of nothing else but saving his daughters. The man found the strength to change clothes, jumped on his snowmobile, and raced towards the highway. When Randy saw that his brother was seriously injured, he placed Rolf in the back seat of his car and drove himself. Although it was the early 1990s, Randy's car was equipped with a mobile phone, which he used to call emergency services. The cell service in the mountains was poor, so Randy tried several times to contact the authorities before succeeding. While he stayed on the line, Randy caught up with the criminals, vehicle and considered running it off the road. He informed the Summit County Sheriff's Department of the incident and gave exact details of the direction the criminal's vehicle was heading. Randy also said that his brother was injured and needed immediate medical assistance. At this point, the call was disconnected, but Randy didn't give up. He stopped at a nearby gas station and used a payphone to notify emergency services. Rolf was soon taken to the hospital in critical condition, and the police engaged in a multi-hour pursuit until the criminals lost control of the vehicle and drove off the embankment. Remarkably, Lanai and Tricia were completely unharmed. They crawled out of the overturned car, raised their hands, and told the officers that they had been held hostage. Police surrounded the car and the criminals were forced to surrender. The terrified girls screamed that the criminals should be shot on the spot because they had killed their grandmother, mother, and father without remorse. Lanai and Tricia gasped for air, overwhelmed by emotions, and had little idea of what had happened in the past few hours. One of the officers turned to the trembling girls and informed them that their father had survived. He also mentioned that Rolf had not only been shot, but also doused with gasoline and set on fire. Nonetheless, their father had found the strength to run almost blindly down the mountain on a snowmobile to save his daughters. This news brought some relief to Lanai and Tricia, who then began to listen to the police's account of what had happened. The girls had always considered their father a hero, but now he had earned that title 100 times over. After Taylor and Day were arrested, they were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and kidnapping. Additionally, they were charged with assault, theft, and arson. Investigations revealed that the criminals had hitchhiked to Weber Canyon and had not chosen the location randomly. Lester Taylor's family owned a cabin nearby, and the criminal was familiar with the area. Taylor and Day spent several days in the mountains, breaking into empty cabins, robbing them, and moving on. They discovered the Teed family when they got on their snowmobiles and headed into town. The burglars sneaked into the cabin and waited for the owners at return to carry out their sinister plan. The officer who arrived first at the scene immediately noticed a large pool of blood in the garage that had frozen due to the sub-zero temperatures. When he entered the house, he could smell burnt hair, skin, and clothing. But he didn't stop. He kept walking slowly. The entire top floor was ablaze. The carpet in the living room was soaked with blood, and what was once a cozy house now looked like a scene from a horror movie. After the fire was extinguished, the investigators were able to examine the house more closely. It turned out that Taylor and Day had dragged the bodies of their victims across the living room floor and out onto the terrace. To cover up their crime, they covered the bodies with blankets and then with snow. The blood of Kate and Beth soaked into the wooden floorboards, seeping through the cracks and forming bright red icicles underneath. One of the officers found a video camera in the cabin with footage that later became crucial evidence in the trial. The video showed Taylor, armed, opening the Tiede family's Christmas presents, while Day laughed and supported his accomplice's actions. During the investigation, the main task of the investigators was to determine precisely which crimes each of the men had committed. According to Lanai, each criminal bore equal responsibility for what had happened. About 5 months after the horrific attack on the Tiede family home, Taylor pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder in exchange for all other charges against him being dropped. He was tried before a jury and claimed throughout the trial that he suffered from memory lapses and could not remember many details of the crime. He was sentenced to death for each murder, but showed no remorse and remained calm and composed even after the verdict was announced. A few weeks later, Edward Stephen Day was brought to trial. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 62 years in prison. Could be released from prison in 2053. However, the judge who presided over the trial recommended that Day should not be released early under any circumstance. Lanai and Tricia testified in both trials, showing incredible bravery in recounting the horrors of that terrible December day despite their age and trauma. The girls spoke calmly, in detail, and without emotion. Lanai was outraged when she was asked to hold the guns that had been used to murder her mother and grandmother during the trial. But she managed to control her emotions and demonstrated in detail how the criminals had acted. When Rolf Teed entered the courtroom, Day's face froze in an expression of utter surprise. At that moment, the girls looked around and realized they had won. None of the criminals had suspected that Rolf had survived and directly contributed to their imprisonment. In 2001, Day wrote a letter to the family of his victims, confessing to the crime. He claimed that he had not intended to kill anyone, only to rob the cabin and escape, but Taylor had other plans. Day said that after the murders, he had no choice but to accept what had happened and move on with his life. It took Lanai more than 9 years to respond to this letter. She decided to forgive Day, but added that forgiving did not mean forgetting. Shortly after writing this letter, she filed a petition with the Pardon Board, requesting that Edward Day not be released under any circumstance. Lanai is still convinced that even as a 70-year-old man, Day is capable of murder and will continue to fight until the end to ensure that Day spends the rest of his life in prison. Despite Taylor's repeated attempts to appeal his sentence, he remains on death row, while Trisha and Lanai wait for the day when they can finally see with their own eyes the life leave the body of the man who killed their mother and grandmother. After Lanai's first marriage ended in divorce, she married her childhood friend and is confident that Nathan has changed her for the better. The couple raises 9 children together and firmly believes that there is much more good in the world than evil. Trisha, a divorced mother of 2, cherishes her life and claims that the terrible December day in 1990 did not define her, but helped her become the person she is today. In the years since the fire, Rolf has worked to rebuild the cabin and make it even better than before. Family still gathers at the cabin for the holidays and enjoys each other's company. Rolf and his daughters believe that criminals should not be allowed to take more from them than they already have. Lanai and Trisha consider the cabin a special place, magical and healing, as if the souls of their mother and grandmother watch over everyone who enters. Rolf lived a fulfilling life, enjoying every moment surrounded by his daughters and numerous grandchildren. When he was diagnosed with cancer, the entire family came together to spend the last weeks of his life with Rolf. He passed away in 2008, surrounded by loved ones. Christmas holidays of 1990 were meant to be one of the happiest celebrations in the Teed family's life. Fate had other plans. Just 3 days after Christmas, Beth Potts and Kate Tide were buried. Lanai remembered her grandmother as a lively, cheerful, and vibrant woman. She was full of life and never boring, always coming up with fun activities for the whole family. Once, Beth even decided to give her granddaughter a wonderful hairstyle herself, which resulted in her hair looking terrible, causing the house to shake with laughter. Kate Teed was an incredibly devoted mother for whom her daughters always came first. The girls considered their mother their most important and loyal friend. She was someone who never judged, always listened, and lived with an open heart. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.